All right, y'all. So I know that my last video indicated that the next series that will be produced on this channel would be pertaining to the true history of the transatlantic slave trade. And that series will still continue on, but just at a later date. And the reason for this sudden pivot is because I feel like this particular topic that I'm about to speak about is far more essential to speak on for this channel because, of course, as I've stated before multiple times throughout this channel's existence, the medieval time period is going to be the main focus of the content on this channel. But this is also going to be a very essential topic for my other channel, which of course I've also referenced before on this channel, which is my biblical channel, which the main topic for that particular channel will focus on who are the descendants of the people in the scriptures known as the Israelites, where they went and migrated to after they had been cast out from their land, who they became in history, and most importantly, who they are to this very day and how we can identify them properly. And so all of that relates to the topics of this video series because these two ethnic groups that I will be speaking about, known to conventional history as the Scythians and the Germans or the Germanic tribes, and even the other tribal group I will be speaking on more in depth about when I cover the medieval Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, known as the Celts, were in fact the descendants of the people in the scriptures known as the nation of Israel. And these ethnic groups were part of the casted out lot of Israelites that migrated to various parts of the Middle East and eventually ended up in Europe. They became the ancestors of pretty much every medieval European population, dynasty, noble family, and kingdom of that era in history. And in order for me to speak about the medieval time period, I feel like it is best to start with these two ethnic groups of people first before I dive into the later empires that came as a direct result of their migration into Europe. And this will synchronize well with the topic on my biblical. This will synchronize well with the topic my biblical channel will be mainly focused on. So for those of you guys who are subscribed to my other channel and will watch the series that I put on that channel pertaining to the nation of Israel and where they were scattered to, I highly recommend that you refer back to this series on this channel and correlate the information that will be presented in this series to what will be presented on my biblical channel. The two series will definitely correlate with one another. But anyways, before I start, let me just state that in this series, one of the main things that will be evident is just how conventional scholarship has lied about the appearance of the earliest settlers and establishers of medieval Europe. The three main groups who are responsible for laying the foundation of later medieval European society and even beyond that time period were the three groups that I mentioned earlier, which are the Celts, who mainly settled in Ireland, Scotland, England, France, Spain, and other areas within Central Europe. We won't get into them that much in this series because it will primarily be about the two major groups that settled in Europe around the same time as the Celts, which were the Scythians, who settled along the Black Sea/Caspian Sea region near what is known as the Pontic Caspian Steppe, which is kind of near Eastern Europe towards modern day Russia. And then we lastly have arguably the most important of these three groups in establishing medieval European culture, which were the Germanic tribes, who a lot of scholars surmise came out of the region in Europe known as Scandinavia, near the southern region of Sweden, and especially near the area in Europe that we of course call today Germany. So all of these three tribes were most responsible for cultivating the culture of Europe post the fall of the Imperial Roman Empire in 476 AD, which is what officially ushered in the Dark Ages, quote unquote, the Dark Ages in European history. And so, but what all of these three tribal groups have in common with one another is, according to most conventional scholars and translators who translated the accounts given by ancient historians like Herodotus, Tacitus, and other Greco-Roman sources of the physical appearance of these tribes, is that they all had reddish blonde hair with blue eyes and allegedly pale skin, even though that's never really outright stated by any of these scholars. The implication by them having reddish blonde hair and blue eyes is that they were in fact pale skinned. Of course, those would constitute as what we would call today so-called Caucasian or white features. So this begs the question of how could any of these ethnic groups have been peoples of color or so-called black, like I'm claiming them to be in this series, if they had these features that we clearly would identify with so-called Caucasian features today? Well, that is definitely a very good question, and it calls back to what I stated just a little bit ago, being that the conventional scholarship of our modern day has outright lied about these physical descriptions and why the Celts, the Scythians, and the Germans were described in this way, and what the words that were used to describe them actually meant back when they were used by the ancient authors who gave physical descriptions of these groups of people. And in order for us to understand just how much they've lied, we're going to, of course, examine these tribal groups, their history, and most importantly, why they were described in the way that they were. So let's get into this by first looking at the tribe, who I'll just come out and say were actually the ancestors of one of the other tribal groups we'll be looking at in this series, that being the Germans. And this antecedent of the Germans are the people known to history as the Scythians. Now, the relation of the Germans to the Scythians is something that has been speculated over the years, but has never really been expounded upon to the degree that it needs to be in order to explore the true origins of these so-called Germanic tribes, who, for those of you who don't know, were the main tribe out of all of the tribal groups we'll be examining in this series that established the over 1,000 year long history in medieval Europe throughout most of Europe, outside of maybe the territories that were ruled over by the Byzantine Empire. But unlike the Byzantine Empire, the Germans' lineage circulated all the way down into the population and royal empires of the Renaissance time period, and even into the 17 to 1800s. So the ancient Germanic tribes were still were and still are a very highly essential and influential group of people in really world history, not just European or Western history. So they'll definitely be the most important tribal group to go over out of all the three we'll be discussing in this series. But before we talk about them, again, we have to speak about their ancestors to get a better understanding of their origins. So let's talk about the Scythians, who again were in fact the ancestors of the Germans, as we'll see throughout this video. So who really are the Scythians? It's not really a name that really echoes throughout history. They're definitely not the first group of people you think about when the topic of European history is discussed. They're most likely way lesser known than their counterparts within Europe at around the same time they appeared, which were the Celts. But their presence in Europe was just as, if not arguably more essential than the Celts. This has a lot to do with the fact that they were not just present within Europe, but they were also ubiquitous all throughout the land we know of as the Middle East, particularly in the region known as Iran. Now, this is the location that most authors suppose they derived from, but as this will be far more expounded upon in my biblical channel, when I examine the origins of the Scythians on that channel, the Scythians were not from Iran. And even most scholars will tell you that they don't really know where the Scythians actually came from. It's just Iran happened to be the place where they were first documented coming out of when they first appeared in history. But they migrated out of this region, and from there they were able to migrate into various areas within Asia, particularly Central Asia and areas like Kazakhstan, which is a region that borders both Russia and China. And they were also present in the region known as the Caucasus, which is situated in the region from Eastern Europe to Western Asia. And then, of course, they were most present in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, and regions such as Poland, Russia, Ukraine, by way of their presence in an area known as the Crimea. And they were also known to have spread themselves out to Romania as well, and were present all throughout the Central European area known as the Balkans. And the Scythians, they were known for the abundance of tribes that were said to have been a part of this band of nomadic warriors who moved frequently from place to place and were never settled anywhere for very long, which is why they were present in so many places all throughout Europe and Asia. But all of their separate tribal groups could be summed up in just four main groups, which were the Pontic Scythians, who resided mainly along the Black Sea region, the Sarmatians, who were mainly settled in the North and Caspian Sea, as well as the Volga River areas near modern Russia, the Masagatei, who we'll speak more about later on in this video, because there was a major group of people that descended from this particular tribe of Scythians. But the Masagatei, they came mainly from the desert steppe within the central region in Asia. And then lastly, there was the Saka, who inhabited most of eastern central Asia. And I want to transition and talk a little bit more about this particular group of Scythians known as the Saka, who were probably the most far to the east in the region of Asia of any Scythian band during their existence. And they were found mainly in the region of northwestern China, and also a region I failed to mention thus far in this video, which is India. Now, these Scythians who were found in India are very interesting, mainly due to the fact that they have a very surprising tie to the origins of the widely popular religion known as Buddhism. Buddhism and the concept of its religion originated mainly in India, and the Scythians have a hand in its creation because it has been supposed over the years and really over the centuries that the man who founded Buddhism, a man who was known during his lifetime as Siddhartha Gautama, was in fact a Scythian himself. And this understanding that this man who will become the image of what we know today as the Buddha was in fact a Scythian will assist us in giving us our first understanding of what these Scythians truly looked like. And these particular Scythians, the ones who derived from India and spread Buddhism out to various regions all over Asia, will become the ancestors of later Germanic tribes that we know of today as the Saxons, or better yet, the Anglo-Saxons, and also the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, who themselves, the Franks, they went on to become the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, and so on and so forth. But all that will be something that is shown later on. But understanding the Buddha will ultimately originally being a Scythian who inspired other Scythian followers of his to spread his teachings out to places like China by way of these followers coming from India to China on what is known as the Silk Road is important for what we will be seeing moving forward. But I just want to prove real quick that in all likelihood, the Buddha was in fact a Scythian. So now let's first get a brief understanding of who the Buddha, aka Siddhartha Gautama, was real quick. He was said to be a nomadic wandering teacher who came from South Asia in and around the 6th and 5th century BC. According to most Buddhist legends, he was born in the city of Lumbini in Nepal, which is an independent country in between India and China. And he was born to noble parents who derived from a clan known as the Shakya clan, who were an quote-unquote Indo-Aryan clan that resided mainly in India and Nepal. Now, this understanding that Siddhartha Gautama or Buddha came from this particular clan is what has led a lot of scholars to believe that Buddha was in fact a Scythian. And they make this assertion based off the fact that the term Shakya seems to have a very close relation to other terms that were applied to the Scythians by other cultures, such as the Persians, who called the Scythians the Sakas, spelled Sakas, and the Indo-Aryans who called them Saka, spelled Saka. And this has led to scholars like the very highly renowned in Central Eurasian Studies, Christopher L. Beckwith, to assert in his work, The Scythian Empire, that Buddha was the quote-unquote sage of the Scythians, or the Shakyas. But a lot of scholars seem to have a problem with this line of reasoning, mainly because there is very little evidence that the terms Shakya and Sakas or Saka have any linguistic relation to one another. And so because of this, a lot of scholars reject the origin of Buddha being a Scythian. But when we look at some of the basic aspects of Scythian history and the time period when the Shakya clan was said to have first appeared in India, the Shakya clan was said to have appeared in India anywhere between the 7th to 5th century BC, which had to for sure have been the timetable of when they first appeared, since Siddhartha Gautama, according to Buddhist tradition, was said to have been born around the 6th century to the 5th century BC within the region of India. So they were first present in India during the 7th to 5th century BC, and this almost perfectly lines up with when the Scythians were said to have made their major migration out of their alleged home country in Iran out to the various places in Europe and Asia they went to. The exact time these migrations occurred was from the 9th century BC to the 7th century BC. So that was right around the time the Shakyas would have made their way into India. But there is definitive evidence that the Scythians did in fact make their way into India around this same time. And I'll just read from a couple of sources that confirm their presence in India from the 7th to the 6th century BC. So this is a book that covers a wide area of the history of a lot of the nomadic tribes that were coming in and out of India. But let's see what it can tell us about the Scythians and when they were first documented making their way into India. And again, this is so that we can align the history of when the clan of of when the clan of the Buddha, the Shakyas, first came into India around the 7th to 6th century BC to when the Scythians first started to make their way into India. So we can see if there is any truth to the notion that Buddha was in fact a Scythian. But anyways, let's read a passage from this book that will assist us in finding out this information. And it is going to come from this paragraph under the heading of View on the Origins of Jats. And this is a quotation from a very well-regarded historian of the 19th century who dedicated most of his work to mainly the region known as the Punjab, which resides in the regions of Pakistan and northern India, which interestingly enough, northern India is where the Shakya clan was mainly based at while they had residence in India. So a bit of correlation can be made there from what we're about to read. But anyway, let's read this passage right here. So according to Sayyid Muhammad Latif, the scholar I mentioned a little bit ago, author of the history of the Punjab, when the Media king Cyaxares checked the advance of the Scythian hordes in the mid 7th century BC, or the mid 7th century BC, from overrunning his Indus domain, the routed Scythians fled to Punjab, where a portion of these settlers, descendants of Massagetay, were called the Gattays, from whom sprung the modern Jats. All right, so we see here that according to this author, not only were the Scythians known to be in the region of India, or as Sayyid Muhammad calls it, Indus, during the 7th century BC, but they ended up scattering into the region of Punjab shortly after their conflict with Cyaxares, who was the king of the Medieval Persians at the time. And again, the Punjab was in the northern region of India, and the Shakya clan was stated to have appeared in the northern region of India in and around that time as well. So it's possible that this migration into India around this time resulted in the Scythians spreading themselves all throughout this country and becoming known by various different names and clans, one of them being the Shakya. And we'll see another clan that migrated into northern India and called themselves a name that was not only similar in spelling and pronunciation as the name of the Shakyas, but also to the name of the greater conglomerate of Scythians as a whole that migrated into India, which was the Shakas, spelled Shakas. But let's look at another source to confirm that the Scythians did in fact migrate to the land of India in and around the same time as the Shakya clan was said to have arrived in India. So now this is a book that was written by, coincidentally enough, from the topic of this series, a German geographer of the 19th century by the name of Friedrich Ratzel. So let's see what he has to say about the Scythians and their migration into India. So in the 7th century BC, an inroads of nomads spoken of as Scythians into India took place. So we see here that this German geographer states that the Scythians migrated into India around the 7th century BC, which was again around the same time in history where it sees the Shakya clan pop up in this region. But the author reveals something else when we read forward, which is that it is possible that these Indo-Scythians, following the same road as has been taken by the Aryan immigrants, came as far as the Ganges, and a view has been expressed that Buddha's dynasty in Kapilavastu was a Scythian offshoot. So we see here an admission to the fact that the Buddha was always thought of to have been of Scythian origin, even during this time in the 19th century, which is important to point out because scholars today who are skeptical or just outright try to refute the Scythian origin of the Shakya clan and of Buddha will try to attribute this as a prevailing theory that has been mainly championed by two German scholars, and Michael Witzel and the man whose book I cited from a little bit ago, that being, who stated that Buddha was the sage of the Shakyas, who was Christopher L. Beckwith. But no, this was something that was believed even before them, and for good reason. There are a lot of historical clues that point to this being the case. One of them being the names of the Scythian tribes that were documented being in India, but particularly in the region of northern India, where the Shakya clan mainly resided. There was one tribe in particular of Scythian origin that was said to have arrived in specifically northern India and in and around the time of the Shakyas, and one of the main indicators of their Scythian origin was their name. But let's see what tribe I'm referring to here. So actually, before I reveal the name of this particular contemporary Scythian tribe to the Shakyas, who migrated to the region of northern India around the same time as them, I forgot to mention that this particular tribe was regarded to be one and the same with another tribe that was said to have derived from the Scythians known as the Nagas, spelled Nagas. whose name quite literally means the serpent people. And that will be something to keep in mind as I go through these sources. But now let's read a little bit about these tribes and how they got their names and how these names can help to identify them as being of a Scythian race who became part of the conglomerate of Indo-Scythians that conquered India in and around the 7th to 6th century BC. So now let's read this. So the Nagas were of Scythic affinities and associated with the serpent totem. So again, pay attention to the origin of them being associated with the serpent. So, but of which some evidence is found in ancient Persian, South Russian myths. Herodotus relates to the story of Hercules, who during his search for his lost mark mated with Echidna, a half woman, half serpent, and left a bow for his sons, the Scyths. Thus does Greek mythology with instructive symbolism explain the origins of the Scythian people. So this author is basically relating a story that was told in the legendary ancient Greek historian Herodotus' histories about the origins of the Scythians and how, according to Herodotus, the Scythians actually descended from Hercules, and as the author cites here, a half serpent, half lady type of creature. According to Herodotus, this was the mother of the ancestor. This was the mother of the ancestor of the Scythians, which thereby would make her the mother of the Scythian tribes. So this can act as a correlation with the name the Nagas tribe was given, which was again the serpent people. But now let's just read on. I'm going to go where it says the very old cast coins with the figure of a snake and the legend of Kadasa in old Brahmi characters, which he found in West Punjab, have been attributed to him by early Takhas, the descendants of the Naga chief Tashaka. All right, so that name right there, I just read, the Tashaka, is the name we're going to pay attention to moving forward, especially when it comes to how it is spelt. The name of the Tashaka tribe looks very similar to that of the Shakya clan that Buddha derived from, and both of these tribal clans' names derive from the name that all of the Indo-Scythian tribes went by once they made their way into India, which was Shaka or the Shakas. Okay, but let's learn a little bit more about the Tashakas and confirm them to have been of Scythian extraction. All right, so this is the Britannica Encyclopedia, which is a very well known encyclopedia set all around the world. So now let's see what it has to say about the origins of the Tashaka and where they derive from. So the Scythic Tashaks are supposed to have been from the source of the great serpent race, the Tashaks or Nagas, who figure so prominently in Sanskrit literature and art, and whose name is still retained by the Naga tribes of our own day. The words Naga and Tashak in Sanskrit both mean a snake or mythological tailed monster. The Tashaks are identified with the Scythian Takas, and then we'll stop right there. But again, we see that the Tashaks or Nagas were in fact identified as a Scythian people, and they were Scythians who were part of the migrations that the Scythians made from the 9th to 7th centuries BC into various areas of the world. But in their case, they mainly settled in India, and I do think it is, I don't think that it is a coincidence that they popped up around the same time bearing a similar name as the Shakya Buddha clan within the same region of India the Shakyas came from, which was northern India. But let's see some proof of this. So this is a book by the 19th/20th century South Asian scholar by the name of George Uglow Pope, who was very well known during his life for the advances he made in the studying of the region in between India and Sri Lanka that he derived from, known as Tamil. And this book he's compiled pertaining to Indian historical studies will give us some more insight into when the Indo-Scythian tribe known as the Tashaks migrated out to India and how their migration correlates when the Shakya clan made their way into India. So now let's read this excerpt right here. So the name Naga or Tashaka equals serpent was given to from which sprang the kings of this dynasty, because a serpent was their national emblem, perhaps also an object of their worship. They were Scythians allied to the Scandinavians and perhaps entered India in the 7th century BC. Okay, so we see at the very end the Tashaks were documented as immigrants to the land of India during the 7th century BC. Again, this was around the same time the Shakya clan made their way into the land of India, and when Siddhartha Gautama also also known as Buddha, made his first appearance in history as well. So again, this can be even more in confirmation that the Shakya clan was part of the Scythian migration out of Media or Iran into the various places they scattered off to. So let's see if we can get further confirmation on this by looking towards even more sources that confirm these Tashakas arrived in India around the same time as the Shakya. So this is a journal from the Anthropological Society in India, which was dedicated to the history and culture of India as a whole. So now let's read what the author of this journal has to say about the origins of the Tashakas. So as the Aryans were spreading the mantle of their civilization over the whole of India, their own race and civilization were also profoundly affected by the conquest of northern India in the 6th century BC by a tribe of Scythian origin called Tashakas, or serpents, by the Hindus or Indians. All right, so we see here that it states that northern India during the 6th century BC, again around the same time and place the Shakyas first appeared in India, was when we see the presence of the Tashaka Scythians make their way into India. So I think it should be becoming more and more obvious that the likelihood of a Scythian origin for the Shakya clan has to be true, considering how much correlation there is between their arrival and the Scythians' arrival in India. They, not so coincidentally, at least from my perspective, have a similar name that was given to them by the ancient inhabitants of India to the Tashaka Scythians, and just the greater part of Scythians that made their way into India as a whole. Again, the Indo-Scythians were called Shakas or Saka, which, even though this was a name given to the Scythians by the Persians and not the Indians, the cultures who saw and interacted with the Scythians tended to give them similar sounding names with similar spellings. The Greeks called the Scythians such names as the Scudia, the Scudoi, the Scudai, the Scudis. The Latins, they called them the Scythi or the Scythae. The Persians called them Sakai, Sakai, Saka, and Shaka, and particularly the last two names were the names the peoples of the Indies gave them as well. So oftentimes the Scythians farther to the east will be called the name the Persians came up with for them, which was Saka or Saka or even Shaka. And the ancient Greek historian Herodotus was known to do this, calling the Scythians Saka or Saka. And he was also the one, if you remember from the first source I read from earlier, that stated that the Scythians derived from Hercules and a half serpent, half woman, half serpent entity, which is why they tended to worship a serpent amongst the Scythians of India. The Sanskrit name the Scythians were given by the Indus people of Naga or Tashaka meant serpent. So it's clear that there was a clear synchronicity of understanding of how to identify the Scythians by all of the ancient cultures who interacted with them. So the names given to the Scythians who immigrated to India, whether it be the general name given to the Scythians in this region, which was of course Saka or Sakai or Shaka or Tashakas, and even ultimately should be understood by now to be a name for this clan because of their Scythian origin, the Shakya, were given to these peoples because they were Scythians. But right now, before I move further, I just want to show a couple more sources that document the first appearances of the Tashakas in India, while the Shakya clan was said to have arrived in India. So this book was written in the 19th century by a geographer by the name of John Colet, who I believe was a professor at Oxford University during this time. But this geographer speaks about the time of arrival of the Tashakas in India, which will pretty much be the same information we've been seeing thus far, but it's just good to get extra confirmation. So let's read what this has to say. So the name Nag given to these places is evidence of the ancient religion of the people of Kashmir, who may have belonged to the Scythian migration into northern India about the 6th century before the Christian era, or the 6th century BC, of course. They were called Takas or Tashaks, and they penetrated far into northern India. And I'm just going to skip down a little bit to where it says the Scythic Tashaks. So the Scythic Tashaks are supposed to have been the source of the great serpent race, the Tashakas or Nagas. So again, we see that another scholar attests to the fact that the Nagas or Tashakas migrated to India particularly northern India, around the same time as the Shakya appeared in northern India, in between that 7th to 6th century BC era. So now let's transition our attention to the Shakya clan and why it is important to understand that they were a part of this Scythian migration into India and were themselves Scythians. And as I've stated already from the beginning of this video, the Scythians were the ancestors of the Germanic peoples. This is something I will show in more depth later on in this video. One of the main ways being through the Sakya clan I've been talking about, and them being the ancestors of a particular Germanic tribe that is very well known in history. But understanding the Scythians will lead us to understanding the Germanic tribes or the Germanic peoples who became the ancestors of pretty much every major medieval European civilization during that time period. Most importantly, though, understanding the true appearance of the Scythians will help us in understanding that what the true appearance of the Germanic tribes were. Because there is a lot of outright disinformation, as I've already said, that has been perpetuated really for centuries pertaining to how the ancient Germanic peoples looked. And even the Scythians have been the subject of a lot of disinformation being put out about them and how they looked. And most of the time, you'll find them and their descendants, the Germanic peoples, being described as having red or blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. This is the idea that most so-called scholars and historians want to put in people's minds to try and obfuscate what the truth is pertaining to how the people who acted as the predecessors of the medieval Europeans looked like, so that the narrative can be that they looked no different from the majority of people who reside in Europe today, who of course will be classified as quote-unquote white today. But let's take a look at the reality of how these ancient European tribes looked by first taking a look at how these Scythians, who produced the originator of the very ancient religion known as Buddhism, known to history as Siddhartha Gautama, looked like. And we'll do this by first confirming that Buddha himself was a Scythian, and then after that we'll see how the Scythians chose to depict him and what that says about their true appearance as a whole. So we've already seen that the tribe Buddha was said to have been a part of was most likely part of the Scythian migration out of ancient Media or Iran into places like India and other places within Southeast Asia. The Shakya clan Buddha claimed descent from was especially found in northern India as early as the 7th to 6th centuries BC, and we've seen that the Scythians did in fact migrate to this region in India and just in the country as a whole around this time as well. Also, the name Shakya was similar to the names given to specifically the Indo-Scythians upon their arrival into India. They again called the Scythians the Shaka or Saka. Other tribes like the Naga Scythians were also referred to as Tashaks, who themselves were found in northern India around the same time as the Shakyas. And coincidentally enough, they too were Buddhists, according to the 19th century English scholar who specialized in ancient Indian studies. So it should be obvious that the Buddha was a Scythian when we connect the dots and see that the arrival of Buddha's tribe in India and his ascension as a sage that went around the world spreading his ideologies correlates with when the Scythians were said to have arrived in India, but yet there is still some uncertainty of whether or not Buddha was truly of Scythian origin or not. And most scholars who are skeptics of this prevailing belief often will attribute this idea to a few modern scholars who I've referenced a couple of times in this video already, that being of course Christopher L. Beckwith, Michael Witzel, and Kenneth Kraft. Now these are very highly distinguished scholars and professors that specialize in Near Eastern Asian studies who have all asserted this. Two of them are highly distinguished linguists in Beckwith and Michael Witzel, and one of them specializes specifically in Buddhist studies, which is Kenneth Kraft. So their findings and their words should be very reliable pertaining to the origin of the Buddha, especially since they all say the same thing. But if further confirmation is needed, we can take a look at other scholars who came before these three that asserted the same things before they ever did and made some interesting connections between the Buddha and his religion and how it correlated with the Scythians and their way of life. So now let's look at one coming from a mid to late 1800s Scottish historian by the name of William Wilson Hunter, who resided in India for a lot of his career and even created an atlas of India during the late 1800s known as the Indian Imperial Gazetteer. And he wrote other works pertaining to the history and linguistics of India. So he was definitely an expert in Indian studies as a whole. And in this book, he has this to say about the belief that Buddha was of Scythian origin. So an effort has been indeed made to trace the Buddha himself to a Scythian origin. He belonged to a royal stock of Sakyas, and the Chinese Chinese records supply an intermediate link between his birthplace in Bengal and the home of his race in Central Asia. And Central Asia was one of the regions a big segment of the Scythians were said to have migrated to once they left their supposed place of origin in Iran, even before they made their way to India. So this author is alluding to the fact that the early Chinese records linked Buddha's origin to a place where a large part of the Scythians went before they reached India. But reading on, these records, supported by Tibetan tradition and the peoples of Tibet, were some of the earliest recipients of Buddha's teachings once the religion spread outside of India and found its way into China, which is what really initiated the spread of Buddhism around the world. But anyways, indicate that a branch of hordes who overran Western Asia around 625 BC made its way into Patala on the Indus, the site selected by Alexander in 325 BC, and still the capital of Sind under the name of Harabad. One portion of these Patala Scythians went westward by the Persian Gulf to Assyria. Another section eventually moved northeast into the Gangetic Valley and became the Sakyas of Kapalavatsu, among whom the Buddha was born. So we see here that this scholar supposes that Buddha's clan were the descendants of Scythians who first started out in Western Asia around the 7th century BC, which was again around the time conventional history states Buddha's clan, the Shakyas, made their way into India. But it's also around the time the other sources I've cited from in this video thus far stated that the Scythians or Shakyas made their way into India, which would mean historically there is a correlation that can be made between what this author is saying and the clan that Buddha derived from being part of that Scythian migration into India around circa the 7th to 6th century BC. But this author doesn't stop there. He goes on further to make other correlations with the customs and traditions of the Scythians and the customs Buddha supposedly came up with himself. So the author goes on to say his or Buddha's dying command that he should be buried according to the old practice of his race and a mound erected over his remains, is opposed to the deeply rooted Indo-Aryan custom of burning the corpse, but it is essentially in accord with the Scythians' mode of disposing of the dead. In the topes or funeral mounds of Buddhism is seen a reproduction of the royal Scythian tombs of which Herodotus speaks. The innumerable statues of the living Buddhists all preserve the same strongly marked non-Aryan type. It is therefore argued that the Christian fathers trace back by no accident the Manichaean doctrine to one Scythianus, whose disciple Terebinthus took the name of Buddha. And then we'll stop right there. But we see from this last part of the passage that there were very clear direct allusions to Scythian culture that was encouraged by Buddha himself and was carried out by his followers after his death, that followed a very specific burial custom that was performed by the Scythians. So if the Buddha was not a Scythian and was instead a quote-unquote Aryan, as a lot of modern scholars would try to suppose he is, how would he even have knowledge of a custom like this that was clearly, as the author states, a non-Aryan custom or practice, but a Scythian one? And then he goes further on to say that even early Christian fathers associated Buddha with being a disciple of the mythological ancestor of the Scythians, who was Scythianus, which could be an allusion to the fact that a lot of Buddha's teachings were Scythian in nature. So from these parallels, we should be able to gather that Buddha was in fact a Scythian in origin. But let's just take a look at a couple more scholars who made this assertion. So this is a book written by an Oxford-educated historian of the 19th century by the name of Hugh George Rawlinson, who specialized in South Asian studies, which is the region of Asia India is in. So, and in this book, he gives us even more parallels pertaining to the culture of the Scythians and the customs and traditions of Buddhism. So starting from where it says this popularity of Buddhism among the Scythian tribes from Peshawar to Bakha and Khotan raises the interesting question whether Gautama himself did not belong to a clan which was Scythian by origin. If the Sakyas were originally Sakas, Sake, or Scythians, it would account for many of the puzzling features of that creed, its metaphysical and un-Indian character, in spite of the Indian garb in which it was naturally enough put forward, its attack on caste, adherence of bloodshed and worship of relics, etc. So right here, Hugh Rawlinson is making a statement saying that if Buddha and the clan he derived from were in fact Scythians, it would answer a lot of questions a lot of questions as to why their culture was so, as he puts it, non-Indian in character, besides the garments they wore. So we can already see from this author, and even from the last author of the Buddha and his clan, had certain cultural practices that would not have existed if they were in fact of quote unquote Indo-Aryan stock, like most tribes in India were at that time. But let's keep reading. So the Dagaba or stupa, which such a feature of Buddhism, has been traced to the critical Tartar tents or by Ferguson and others. So according to this author, the Buddhist Dagabas, which were like structures that acted as shrines or memorials for important Buddhists within that religion, were found by contemporary scholars of his to have been of quote unquote Tartar origin. Now the Tartars are another story for another day, but for the most part, most scholars will agree that the Tartars at the very least have a very close relationship to the Scythians and to Scythian culture, but at most they were Scythians themselves. So again, Rawlinson is giving us more parallels between the culture of the Scythians and the culture of Buddha, which is looking like derived from the culture of the Scythians. But reading on, the ancestral temples of the Scythians described by Herodotus may have been rude Dagabas erected to cover the body of the semi-divine chieftain and the victims who accompanied him. One of the keenest of the clans who drove for the relics of the Buddha were the Vagi or Vasali. Beale has tried to show that these are none other than the Yue Shi, as such appear in regular Scythic garbs on the Sanchi sculptures, which are Buddhist sculptures, by the way. So if this is so, there were Scythians in India in the days of Gautama, and as I've already shown, there definitely were Scythians that were in India in the days of Gautama Buddha, and there is no reason to doubt that the Sakyas or the Vagi were two clans of this nation. Alright, so that was a lot, but again, we can see the parallels that existed between the Scythian culture and the Buddhist practices were there. Not only were the burial rituals the same as from what we saw in the last example I showed, but also the clothes that were worn by Buddhists in the Sanchi sculptures that he references were also very similar. So the Buddha, from all the sources that I've cited from, and from all the scholars, both modern and from a couple of centuries ago, who have already made it clear that they believe Buddha was in fact of Scythian origin, indicate that he had to have been a Scythian for sure. And I'll just throw in one last relatively modern author just for the sake of this topic, who was a British scholar and professor in Chinese studies and also the head of the International Duohang Project, which accentuates the history of the famous Silk Road in China. And the Silk Road will be a major component of this video in a minute here, because it was through this road that the first Buddhists, who were Scythians, brought the Buddhist religion over to China. But anyway, in her book, she says, in her book, Life Along the Silk Road, she says, or she states, the founder of Buddhism, the historical Buddha Gautama, was a prince born to a Sakya or Scythian tribe on the border of present-day Nepal and India, southwest of Kathmandu, in the 6th century BC, hence this later name Sakyamuni, sage among the Sakyas. So even this highly renowned scholar states that she understands Buddha to have been a Scythian, while also giving a lot of interesting information pertaining to how he was born of a Scythian tribe in India sometime around the 6th century BC. Again, I showed that the Scythians were indeed a factor in India around that time, if not a little bit before, and coincidentally they pop up at the exact same time as the Shakya clan Buddha came out of, who had a similar name to the Scythians who had migrated out to India overall, the Saka or the Shakya. So again, it should be relatively obvious by now that Buddha as well as his clan were indeed Scythians. Now I know a lot of you guys may be asking, why is it so important to identify Buddha with the Scythians, to the point where I've spent the first however many minutes talking about this in detail? Well, the reason why it is so essential to understand that not only Buddha, but the first Buddhists who worshipped him as a divine figure and ultimately would spread Buddhism all throughout the world, starting in the country of China, is because of the way Buddha was depicted, especially how he was originally portrayed by the people who first worshipped him, who again were Scythians. The first people to worship the Buddha and cultivate the Buddhist religion were in fact Scythians, and this will help us understand how the Scythians truly looked like in history, because as I stated earlier, there is this prevailing narrative that the Scythians were these so-called Caucasians with red hair, blue eyes, and pale skin, much like their Germanic descendants. But in reality, the Scythians were in fact what we would call today, or what we would classify today as peoples of color, or so-called black people. And we're going to see how that is by first taking a look at how Buddha was originally depicted and described. So the Buddha, as we've already seen, historically lines up with being a Scythian, who was part of the Scythian band of nomads that migrated out of Iran to one of the main locations they ended up at, which was of course India and the adjoining places that surrounded India. So again, keep that in mind. Or keep in mind the evidence that I've shown for Buddha's very likely Scythian origin as I read over the descriptions given by eyewitness accounts who saw how Buddha was depicted in some of the most ancient temples that housed the most ancient statues of Buddha known at the time. This will give us an idea of what the Scythians truly looked like, especially considering the fact that Buddha himself was a Scythian. So now let's read this first book I have pulled up right here, which was written by one of the foremost truth tellers of real history during the late 1700s going into the 1800s by the name of Godfrey Higgins. And his foremost work, The Anacalypsis, is a book that I recommend all you brothers and sisters who are watching this video read, because it does reveal a lot about ancient history all the way down to antiquity concerning what the people living during those time periods actually looked like. And this was a so-called Caucasian man who, again, he lived during the 1700s going into the 1800s when so-called slavery and racism against so-called blacks were at its almost peak level. So this person can't be considered a so-called Afrocentrist or Pan-Africanist writer who was trying to insert so-called blacks in a time period and place in history where they did not belong, and push a narrative that blacks were more than slaves from Africa. All right, so just keep that in mind as well as we move forward, because the vast majority of the writers I will cite from were the exact same as this author I'm about to read from. They were so-called Caucasians living at a time when there was quote unquote racial tensions between whites and blacks who had no ties to any sort of black liberation or reformation group at all. So just keep that in mind as I read. But let's take a look at this book right here. The Anacalypsis, and see what Godfrey Higgins has to say about the appearance of some of the oldest depictions that portrayed Buddha, who was a Scythian, right? So M. Cruiser, who by the way was a very well-known and acclaimed student of languages and archaeology during his time. So just keep that in mind. But M. Cruiser observes that the images of Krishna and Buddha are so similar that it is difficult to distinguish them, and the group pictured above is acknowledged by Moore in his Hindu pantheon to be applicable to Buddha on the knee of his beautiful mother Maya. I just want to pause there and acknowledge the fact that Godfrey Higgins cites this German archaeologist by the name of George Friedrich Kreuzer, who states that Buddha and another Indo-Hindu god by the name of Krishna look so similar that it was hard to distinguish between the two of them in regards to which one was which. And the reason why this is interesting is because the Hindu god Krishna is oftentimes, or at least was oftentimes, depicted with black skin color, and the name of this so-called Hindu god quite literally means black. So just keep that in mind as we read further. But yet there is one circumstance of very great importance which is peculiar to Buddha and forms a discriminating remark between him and Krishna, which is that he continually described as a Negro, not only with a black complexion, in which he agrees with Krishna, but with woolly hair and a flat face. So isn't that interesting? So the Buddha, an entity that we've already seen was most likely created by the Scythians, who migrated their way into India around the 7th or 6th century BC, was portrayed as a so-called black man, or as this passage states, a Negro. Now, what type of race of people who presumably were supposed to be light-skinned with light hair and light eyes would depict an entity that they created as a so-called black man? Nowadays, if you look up a picture of the Buddha, you may see a depiction of Buddha with light skin or even golden colored skin with a lot of times blue eyes, which is how you would think these ancient depictions of Buddha would have looked. But no, we see here that Godfrey Higgins, per the account of these two scholars he's citing from, who saw a lot of the ancient statues of Buddha themselves, and he himself also most likely saw these ancient statues, describes them as looking negroid in appearance. So that's very interesting. But let's keep reading on to see even more vivid descriptions of how Buddha was portrayed according to Godfrey Higgins. So Mr. Moore on his woolly head says some statues of Buddha certainly exhibit thick Ethiopian lips, but all woolly hair. There is something mysterious and unexplained connected with the half of this and only of this Indian deity. So a couple of things here. First off, this other scholar Godfrey Higgins is citing from states that even though just some of these Buddha statues he was seeing portray him to have had thick lips, all of the statues he found, all of them portrayed Buddha with quote-unquote woolly hair. So that tells us that this was a common occurrence with how the Buddha was originally depicted. All of his oldest statues portrayed him with woolly or quote-unquote kinky hair. So there's that, but he also mentions that one of the scholars he cited from states that Buddha was the only Indian but really Scythian deity that was found to have had woolly hair. Just like the statement that I read earlier that was made where it was said that the only difference between the Buddha and the other Hindu god he was being compared to in this excerpt, Krishna, was that Buddha had woolly hair and Krishna did not. So this should help us understand that Buddha had to have been of a different race from the other gods that were being worshipped by the people of the Indus region at the time, which should just confirm even more that Buddha was not originally a quote-unquote Indian deity, but that he was a deity that was created by another group of people that differed from the rest of the population at the time in India, who we should already know to be the Scythians. Let's keep reading further along. So the fact of so many different tales having been invented to account for his crisped, woolly head is alone efficient to excite suspicion that there is something to conceal, something to be ashamed of more than meets the eye. The reason why Buddha is a Negro, at least in the very old icons, I trust I shall be able to explain a satisfactory manner hereafter. So we see here confirmation that in the very old icons of Buddha, meaning the ancient or original icons of the Buddha, he was portrayed as a man with Negroid features, having a so-called black complexion and woolly hair as well. So this should tell us that the people who originally deified the Buddha and made him into an idol figure by creating statues of him and other paintings that we'll see later on to portray his likeness, they chose to depict him as a so-called black man. Now we already know the Buddha was a Scythian who came from a Scythian clan and even implemented Scythian customs and traditions into the Buddhist religion that he created, which should confirm his Scythian origin. So with that being the case, could how the Buddha was depicted indicate how the Scythians looked themselves? Well, we'll get the answer to that in a little bit, but for now, let's go ahead and take a look at a few more attestations made by scholars who found some of the oldest temples and sepulchres that house the original depictions of Buddha and found these same things our first author, Godfrey Higgins, found and other contemporary scholars found when they visited the ancient tombs of Buddha. So now this is a book that really is just a compilation of letters written by German travelers and scholars that was translated by a woman named Sarah Austin, who specialized in German to English translations. So let's read one of these letters that she was able to translate that tells us about what some of the scholars of her day had to say about the ancient depictions of Buddha they saw and how they looked. So Daniel's magnificent work on the celebrated temple of Elora, hewn in the solid rock, interested me uncommonly. The age of these majestic remains is a completely unknown. It is highly curious and in full conformity with Merkel's hypothesis that the most ancient civilization of the world originated with the Negro races, that the statue of the deity and the sanctuary of the oldest temple of the Buddha distinctly exhibits the peculiar features and woolly hair of a Negro. So again, we see here that more archaeologists, which is who these two men that were described in this letter were, found that in the most ancient temples of Buddha, like the temple of Elora, which is still around today and resides in modern day India, observed that the Buddha was portrayed with having the quote unquote peculiar features and woolly hair of a Negro. The last sentence makes that a definitive statement, but it also states that this was something that was found when uncovering the oldest temple of the Buddha, which should tell us again that the original depiction of the Buddha had to have been a so-called black man, which also means that the real life figure who was deified into the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, and the other people of his clan, the Shakyas, had to have looked the same way or a similar way. Remember, the Shakya clan in all likelihood was part of the band of Scythians that migrated into India around the 7th to 6th century BC, which is the exact time frame that they were found in India. So they were of Scythian descent. descent, and as I've already emphasized, Buddha himself was Scythian as well. So we should start to be able to kind of envision what these Scythians actually looked like. But let's take a look at a couple more confirmations of the quote-unquote Negroid appearance of the Buddha being the original way in which he was portrayed. All right, so now let's quickly read through a couple of sources that confirm the antiquity of Buddha's image as a so-called black man. First, by looking at this book, which was the completed works of the man who was the first governor of the East Indian Company in England during the 1600s, Thomas Smith, with extra added commentary by the editor who included new information that had been found during their time in the 19th century. So let's read what this has to say about the Buddha. So the Buddhists of Asia, comprising 300 million of mankind, represent their principal deity Buddha with Negro features and hair. Captain Colin Mackenzie has described a statue of Buddha in an ancient temple in Villagram on the coast of Ceylon, which is in South Asia, of which he says that the countenance is full and mild, and the top of the head painted to represent the hair in several small curls of black color. In another paper by Lieutenant Mahoney on the remains of the sculpture in Ceylon, an image of the Buddha at Kalni near Colombo is compared with the one at Bodh Gaya in the province of Bihar in Hindustan. It is observed that both of these statues agree in having crisp hair and long pendant earrings. All right, so we see here that there were two instances where images of Buddha were found to have quote-unquote Negroid features. So now let's move on to another book written by a 19th century lexicographer who studied at Oxford named Sir Monsieur Williams, who states, Buddhism originated in India around 500 BC. It was a reformation of Brahmanism introduced by a man named Gautama, afterwards called Buddha the Enlightened, of the Sakya or Saka tribe, whose father was king of a district situated under the mountains of Nepal. It is noteworthy that the images of Buddha generally represent him with features and hair of an Egyptian or Ethiopian type, with the curly hair of a Negro. So again, the Buddha is likened unto a Negro in appearance. So the message should be clear by now. The original image of Buddha was that of a so-called black man, and this can only be because the people who originally worshipped Buddha as a deity, who also happened to come from the same Scythian tribe Buddha came from, had to have been of that same appearance. And this was something that was attested to by many scholars as well, who stated that the appearance of the Buddha as it was portrayed in the old images and statues and relics that were created of him not only indicated that his appearance had to have been what his appearance had to have been, but also that what the appearance of the people who made him into a deity figure had to have been as a result of their choice to depict him in that way. But we'll take a look at some of those accounts after I show a couple images that show what these scholars were looking at when they saw a lot of the ancient sculptures and depictions of the Buddha, and why they stated that he was a quote-unquote distinctly Negroid looking person, because it is very apparent when you look at the original statues of the Buddha that he was in fact portrayed as a so-called black man. So now let's just take a look at some of those statues real quick. All right, so this is a Buddha head that was dated to have been made around the 5th to 6th century AD near the Vietnamese region of Mekong. And Vietnam, for those of you who don't know, like India, is in South Asia, and the Buddhist religion from its earliest years of being spread became heavily popular in the neighboring countries of India in southern Asia, and one of those countries was the one where this head came from, which again was Vietnam. Now this obviously is not an original head from the ancient temples in India or Nepal where the Buddhist religion started, but the point I'm trying to get across in the image of this Buddha head and the other ones I will show is that this is what the writers we just read from were referring to when they said that the statues and sculptures of the Buddha from the most ancient statues that have been created and dedicated in his honor depicted him as a so-called Negroid man with Negro features. And this is something that can easily be seen when looking at this Buddha head. The face is clearly very Negroid with thick lips, a flat nose, and very tightly curled hair. So this is what those scholars meant when they said they had found the Buddha as a quote-unquote Negro with Negroid features, and the fact that a whole another culture outside of Buddha, outside of India, depicted the Buddha in this way. Just goes to show that this was the uniform understood appearance of Buddha in former times. This looks nothing like the modern day portrayals of Buddha that show him as either a conventional quote unquote Asian looking fat man, or even a light skinned so-called Caucasian man with blue eyes, which is probably the most preferred look of the Buddha that conventional scholarship would like to have pushed, especially since they know that the people that Buddha descended from were the Scythians. But again, this is an example of what a lot of those scholars would have seen when they laid their eyes on the Buddha statues that had been erected in the most ancient temples dedicated to the Buddha in ancient times, when they were discovered. So, but I just want to show a few more just to confirm that the uniformity of this being, that the Buddha of this being the Buddha being portrayed as a Negro in ancient times. So now this is yet another Buddha head. This time this is from the 8th century CE, and it was found in Thailand, which was another South Asian country that neighbored India. And again, we can see clearly that the Buddha is portrayed here as a so-called Negroid-looking man with Negroid features. It's fairly obvious that this is the case. And so now here is another Buddha statue from Thailand dated around the same time as the last one in the 8th century CE. And again, this Buddha head portrays the Buddha as having Negroid features, i.e. as he was described by those scholars whose accounts we read from, who saw the ancient temples of Buddha and stated that he had woolly hair, thick lips, and a flat nose. Okay, and then this depiction of Buddha clearly has all of those things, so there's no need to question that. And now here's here's an actual Indian Buddha head dated pretty early from the 5th century CE. And again, we can see the Negroid features, even though the nose is conventionally broken off, which is kind of reminiscent of how a lot of the ancient Egyptian sculptures have had their features altered or completely disemboweled, as to try and throw off people from understanding what the original appearance was of that population. But with this ancient Buddha head, we can see that he was portrayed again with Negroid features. The tightly curled woolly hair and thick lips is fairly seen, even with the nose being destroyed somehow, right? So this is clearly meant to depict a so-called black man. And here is another Buddha head that was said to have come from India as well, around the same time as the last one, which was around like the 5th century CE. And here we can see the full features a little bit better. The nose is not as defamed as the last one, and he's depicted here with, again, a flat nose, thick lips, and clearly woolly hair. So this is just yet another example of what those scholars we read from would have saw when they stated that the oldest Buddha temples housed Buddha statues that were very Negroid in appearance. And so now here are just a couple more Buddha heads I'll show before I move on, so that you guys can get an even better visual of what the Buddha would have looked like. All right, so now that we've seen those, I just want to show one last depiction of the Buddha that will act as the perfect segue into my next point, that being who the original Buddhists were that created the ancient images of the Buddha and what they looked like themselves. Now, of course, from the various statements I've made so far in this video, as well as the evidence that I've shown, it should be fairly obvious that the original quote-unquote Buddhists and creators of the Buddha as a deity were the people who have been the main subject of this entire video, that being, of course, the Scythians. The Scythians were the first people to worship the Buddha as a deity and spread his teachings all throughout Southern Asia and then to the greater part of Asia in places like Japan, Tibet, Korea, and of course China, which caused them to become Buddhists as well, and have the religion of this mysterious figure be one of the foremost belief systems in their entire country. But how can we prove this to be true? There is a lot of speculation of who originally worshipped the Buddha and spread his teachings all throughout the earth, to the point where to this very day, the Buddhist religion is the third or fourth most popular religion in the world. But of course, my answer to that speculation will be that the original Buddhists were in fact Scythians, and it is evident by the fact that the Buddha himself was indeed a Scythian. So if Buddha was in fact a Scythian, then why wouldn't his followers, who would have been members of his tribe and the closest people to him when he first started teaching, also be Scythians themselves? And most importantly, if Buddha being a Scythian is the case, which indeed it is, then wouldn't that mean that the Scythians who worshipped him as a quote-unquote god and decided to depict him anciently as a so-called black man with negroid features mean that they also had to be people of the same likeness or of the same appearance? Okay, this is a question that can be answered by first looking at one last depiction of the Buddha, which shows him as having a quote-unquote black complexion. Now we should know from the images I've shown and from the accounts that have been given by people who excavated statues of the Buddha from ancient Buddhist temples that this is how Buddha was originally depicted. Before the portrayals that showed him as a man with pale or golden skin with blue eyes, he was originally depicted as a man with very tightly curled quote-unquote woolly hair, as some might call it, with thick lips and a black complexion. So one might be able to come to the conclusion that the people who originally portrayed Buddha like this had to have been of the same appearance, especially since it should be understood that Buddha was first worshipped by people who came from the same tribe he was from, which of course again was the Scythians. And this correlation was made by some scholars who also saw the first portrayals of the Buddha and stated that since he was depicted as a so-called black man, the first people to propagate this image of the Buddha had to have been of the same appearance. So let's just read some of those accounts, and please understand that I'm not necessarily using these accounts as confirmations that the followers of Buddha had to have been so-called black just like him, since these scholars are just giving their educational opinion based off of what they found. But what these accounts will act as is a good correlation for the confirmations we will receive later on. All right, but let's just see a few of these accounts real quick. All right, so this book is just basically a compilation of scholarly articles that were written. And so we're going to look inside of it and see what one scholar stated about what he found and submitted to the scholarly organization, which is still around to this very day, known as the Asiatic Society, which basically just aims to further studies within the area we know today as the Middle East and parts of Asia. But anyway, let's read what he had to say about the Buddha and how his appearance helps to indicate about his followers and what they looked like themselves. So let's read this. So Mr. Wolford, in his treatise on Egypt and the Nile and the Asiatic researches, informs us that many very ancient statues of the god Buddha in India have crisped, curled hair with flat noses and thick lips, nor can it reasonably be doubted that a race of Negroes formerly had power and preeminence in India. So we see here that this scholar makes the assertion that because of how the most ancient statues of Buddha, meaning the first original statues of Buddha, portrayed him as a so-called black man with what one could call negroid features, that there had to have been a race of Negroes or so-called blacks ruling in India at one point in time. All right, so this of course is an allusion to the group of people that came into India around the 7th to 6th century BC and were actually able to colonize and establish empires within India later on. But this is an allusion to the first followers of Buddha being the race of quote-unquote Negroes that once held preeminence in India. So that's our first scholarly account, who stated that the original followers of the Buddha had to have been so-called Negroes. Okay, so now let's look at another account given by a very well-known 19th century self-taught Egyptologist and archaeologist by the name of Gerald Massey, who took a great interest in studying ancient civilizations during his time. Of course, being an Egyptologist, he mainly focused his studies in the region of ancient Egypt, but he also studied other ancient quote-unquote Asiatic civilizations as well. One of them, of course, being India. And you can't really study the history of India without learning the country's most famous figure of its history, which of course is the Buddha. So let's see what he had to say about the Buddha, and again about what his appearance meant for his followers and how they had to have looked like themselves. So let's read this. So it is not necessary to show that the first colonizers of India were Negroes, but it is certain that the black Buddha of India was imagined in the Negro type, or in the Negroid type, and the black Negro god, whether called Buddha or Satnahasi, he we have a datum. They carry in their color the proof of their origin. The people who first fashioned and worshiped the divine image in the Negroid mode of humanity must, according to all knowledge of human nature, have been Negroes themselves. So again, we see here that another scholar stated that the image of the Buddha as a so-called black man had to have indicated that the people who first worshipped Buddha originally had to have been so-called black as well. And as we should always keep in mind, the original people who worshiped the Buddha were in fact Scythians, okay? But we'll see more of that as we move forward. But let's just look at one more statement given by a scholar that stated Buddha and his followers were quote unquote Negroid in appearance, in their opinion. And in this particular person also makes a very interesting connection between the Buddha and the group of people I've been stating this entire time were the tribe that Buddha descended from and who became his first followers and the ones who would first spread Buddhism out to all areas all over India and other Asian countries like Vietnam, Japan, and China, which will be the country, China, that we delve into next after I cite what this particular scholar had to say about the Buddha and his appearance. All right, but let's just read what this particular individual I'm referring to had to say before we move on to the next phase in this video. All right, so let's read this one last excerpt from this book right here, written by a Portuguese physician who later became a renowned Indologist and historian by the name of Jose Gerson de Cuana. And we're just going to get one last confirmation that scholars who were digging up some of these first remains of the ancient artifacts of the Buddha and his religion were finding that he was being portrayed as a so-called black man, and that since his followers portrayed him as such, they had to have been so-called black themselves. And as I stated a little bit ago, this scholar actually makes the same connection I've made throughout this entire video between the Buddha being a descendant of the Scythians, but also him being portrayed as a so-called black man. But let's just get into this excerpt to see what I'm talking about here. So Gautama Buddha was born in 624 BC at Kapila or Kapila Vastu at the foot of the mountains of Nepal. The present site of the town Nagara near the river Gogra, about 100 miles north of the holy city of Benares, the Athens of Hindustan. He or Buddha belonged to the family of the Sakyas or self-potential, by which patronymic he is often named with the suffix muni, a devotee or an ascetic, or with that of Sena, a lion peculiar to the military class, hence Sakya Muni meant an acolyte of the family of the Sakyas. He is also named Sakya Sena or Scythian lion. So there's the connection he made between Buddha and his Scythian origin, but let's just keep reading on to see what other connection he makes. So the fancied etymology of the latter name combined with the sculptured appearances of Gautama Buddha has given rise among some writers to speculations about the originator of Buddhism not being a native of Hindustan, but of Scythia or Abyssinia. All right, so we see here first that the connection was made by way of the name of Buddha being traced back to mean Scythian lion, according to this scholar. But then he also admits that because of how much was being found, that undoubtedly made a connection between the Buddha being a Scythian, but also, as we've seen many times thus far in this video, as a Negro or a so-called black man, which led scholars to believe that Buddha had to be either of Scythian origin, as the author states, or Abyssinian origin, which was just another way of saying Ethiopian or so-called black African. So the author of this book even goes on to state that a very highly renowned English scholar from the 1700s by the name of Sir William Jones, who became a student of Indian history and its religious evolution over the centuries, stated that Buddha had the appearance of an African because of the constant discovery of him having woolly hair and other Negroid features, and that he had to have been of so-called African descent. So it should be clear by now that Buddha was indeed originally portrayed as a so-called black man with Negroid features, and that there was a belief that the original worshippers of this man as a deity had to have been so-called blacks themselves. And as even this scholar says, the Buddha was thought to have been of Scythian origin because of the many different connections that have been made between him and the name of the clan he came from in India. I remember the Shakya clan, as well as the name this author states he went by while he was alive, Sakya Muni, which meant the Scythian lion. Right, so if Buddha, who was a Scythian, was portrayed as a so-called black man by the same people who originally carried out the veneration of him as a deity figure, who were also Scythians themselves, then they should have been, as the authors that we've seen describe them, they should have been quote unquote Negroid people too, with the same Negroid features that Buddha had while he was alive. Okay, well, one way we can figure out if this was true or not is by taking a quick look at how they chose to portray themselves in their own art. As I've already mentioned a couple of times in this video, the Scythians who originally carried out the worship of Buddha ended up spreading their belief system into other regions outside of India, mainly in Asian countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Japan, Korea, and other places within Southern to Central Asia is where the original Buddhists spread their belief system to. But the most well-known country where Buddhism eventually became the predominant belief system was the most powerful country in all of Asia, which of course was China. And these Scythian Buddhists were able to spread their religion into China by way of many very large and vast trade routes that collectively became known as the Silk Road. This series of trade routes connected most of the regions in Asia as well as Southern Europe in places like Rome and Greece, as well as some areas within Africa as well. So it was a major hub for many different cultures to migrate and spread ideals all throughout each country these trade routes connected to. And this was primarily how Buddhism became so widespread throughout the world. But just focusing on China, the Chinese started to see a large influx of Buddhists from India coming to their country and spreading their ideals around the 1st century CE. And from the 1st century to the 4th century is when the rapid spread of Buddhism in China took place until it was, as I've already stated, the predominant religion in China. So the Chinese felt like they had to commemorate this new form of enlightenment and how it was spread by creating various different murals within a series of caves within the city of Dunhuang in western China that became known as the Mogao Caves. And these Mogao caves were painted by Buddhists who attempted to convey ancient legends and stories that came from the original source of Buddhism, that being the Scythian Buddhists from India. And it's worth noting that Dunhuang, the city where these caves are found at, was a major destination on the Silk Road. So there is no doubt that the travels along the Silk Road that were made by the Indo-Scythians who came to China by way of this route was a major inspiration for these murals being painted. And as we're going to see, the Buddhists who came from India to China, who were Scythians, are depicted in these murals very differently from how Buddhists that were most likely from China, and even the Buddha himself was portrayed in a lot of these murals. There is a distinction between a lot of the Chinese Buddhists who are portrayed as light-skinned and how they portrayed the Buddha who is depicted as a more light-skinned, quote-unquote Chinese-looking man. But of course, as we should know, Buddha was originally depicted as a so-called black man with Negroid features, including dark skin, right? And from the educated opinion given by the scholars I cited from a little bit ago, the appearance of Buddha acted as a representation for how his original followers, who were again the Scythians, who migrated to India as far back as the 7th century BC, looked themselves. So we know that these light-skinned portrayals of the Buddha cannot be the original way in which Buddha was portrayed when his likeness was first brought to China by the Indo-Scythians. So there must be some other depictions of him that show him as he originally looked, right? Well, the answer to that question is yes, there is. And there are also depictions of the Indo-Scythian monks that show them to be of the same appearance as Buddha, just as the scholars stated his original followers were. So we're going to take a look at those. But first, I'm just going to go about proving that the Indo-Scythians were the exact group of Buddhists that spread their religion into China by way of the Silk Road, which once again, the city where the Mogao Caves are located in Dunhuang was a major hub for cultural ideas to be brought into China. So there is no doubt that the Indo-Scythians traveled to this city during the early stages of the missionary work to China. So now let's read this book, which comes from a German publishing foundation that focuses mainly on publishing books about history. And the two editors and authors of this book are German PhDs and professors of Buddhist and Chinese studies by the names of Anne Hermann and Stefan Peter Bumbacher. So let's read their very brief statements about how the original Buddhists, who were of course Scythians from India, arrived in China at the same exact city the Mogao Caves were made in, which of course is the city of Dunhuang. But let's read what this has to say. So the Khyber Pass also served as the starting point for the Buddhist missions to the east along the so-called Silk Road, whereas the Sogdian and Parthian missionaries took the northern branch along the Tarim Basin. The Indians and Indo-Scythians traveled on the southern route from Yarkand over Khotan and Maran to Dun Huang. All right, so again, the so-called Indo-Scythians, aka the original worshippers of the Buddha, ended up settling in the same city in which the Mogao caves were constructed, Dun Huang. And as for the last author we read from stated, the Indo-Scythians were there before the construction of these caves, which started around 366 CE, after a most likely Indo-Scythian Buddhist monk who was named Lezun had a vision which ended up becoming the divine inspiration behind the construction of these caves in Mogayo. And even though that name sounds Chinese in origin, which it is, I'll show in a minute how the Indo-Scythians took on Chinese names once they settled in China and started to create habitations out there. All right. But before I show that, I just want to point out real quick how these authors mentioned two other groups of Buddhist missionaries that arrived in China around the same time as the Indo-Scythians did. The authors mentioned that two groups of people known as the Parthians and Sogdians traveled along the northern branch on the Silk Road to China near the Tarim Basin. And I wanted to point these two ethnic groups out because both of these groups were quote-unquote Scythian in origin. And even though I'm not going to go over the origin of the Sogdians and especially the Parthians as of now, this is important to bring to attention because it goes to show that, again, the original Buddhists truly were Scythians and that the Buddha himself had to have been of Scythian origin, seeing as though the first people to be aware of him and receive his teachings were Scythians themselves. But the Parthians especially will be relevant a little bit later on in this video as I delve into the other Scythian groups at the time of their expansion all across Europe and Asia, and what they actually looked like as well. But we'll see that later. But now let's take a look at what I mean when I stated that the Indo-Scythians who migrated to China and settled there permanently took on Chinese names by just reading a little bit about a very important Indo-Scythian monk who helped translate some of the earliest Buddhist texts to Chinese during the early years of Buddhism spreading out throughout China. Now let's see who this Indo-Scythian monk is that took on a Chinese name and the Chinese culture as a whole, which is one of the reasons why he became one of the first foreigner Buddhist monks that migrated to China to translate the most ancient Buddhist texts at the time into the Chinese language. So Zhu Fahu, which is undoubtedly a name of Chinese origin, Dharmaska, 233 CE, one of the most influential Buddhist translators during the Western Jin regime, grew up in an ancient Indo-Scythian immigrant family who settled in Dun Huang in northwest China for generations. All right, so not only do we see that this Indo-Scythian Buddhist monk took on a Chinese name, just like the Buddhist monk that inspired the creation of the Mogao caves in 366 CE did, but he also descended from an Indo-Scythian family who settled in Dun Huang. Again, the same exact city the Mogao caves were made in, and this book states this family had been settled in this city for generations. Okay, so this once again shows that the Indo-Scythians were in fact in the city of Dun Huang, and that they also were present in this city before the building of the Mogao caves. But we can also infer that it is probable that the man who inspired the creation of these caves, Lezun, was an Indo-Scythian himself, even though no one really knows for sure. His origins are very mysterious. But we can come to the conclusion that he was a descendant of these Indo-Scythians that migrated to China around the 1st century CE, given the history that they had in that city and their influence on the understanding of Buddhism in China overall. So now I think we have a pretty good grasp on the fact that these Scythians were the ones that not only were the first to spread Buddhism all over the country of China, but that they were the ones who created the Mogao caves and Dun Huang. But before I move on to my next point, I just want to give even more confirmation that these Indo-Scythians were the ones that created these caves and influenced the spread of Buddhism in China far and wide. All right, so now let's read this book written by a professor of Chinese Buddhist art by the name of Marilyn Martin Rai. to see that the Scythian Buddhists that came to China were the first to spread Buddhism and also to create Buddhist art like the Mogao caves in China. So now let's read a little bit of this so we can begin to understand that in the two earliest phases of Buddhism in China, that of the later Han and of the Three Kingdoms Western Qin, the Buddhist art had complex levels undoubtedly fitting the status and the circumstances of the religion at the time in China. Besides the influences received from the activity of Chinese trade and conquest in Central Asia, indications are that the foreign population of Wei Qi, Indo-Scythians or Kushans, Parthians, Indian and Central Asians in China were mostly engaged with the international commerce, may have been a major factor in stimulating Buddhist art at this time. All right, so we see here that it was the Indo-Scythians along with the Parthians, who again were Scythians themselves, along with other groups from India and Central Asia, which could have also been Scythian since a lot of the Scythians migrated to Central Asian countries as well, that stimulated and established Buddhist art all throughout China. And of course, this would include the Mogao caves. So again, the Scythians that migrated to China created a lot of their early Buddhist art and architecture that will be important to keep in mind as we move forward. But what also is important to keep in mind is that the Scythians were indeed the first ones to bring the knowledge of Buddha to China, and understanding this can help us grasp that they were indeed the first ones to have the knowledge of creating Buddhist art, such as what is portrayed in the city of Dunhuang and the Mogao caves. So now let's just read a few more scholars' statements about the Indo-Scythians being the first ones to spread Buddhism all throughout China, and then we're going to take a look at some of the images from these Mogao caves to see how the Scythians depicted themselves on some of the earliest murals that were painted on these caves. All right, so this book comes from a 19th century Indian Hindu monk and religious teacher by the name of Swami Vivekananda, who wrote a lot of significant works about the religious history of India. So now let's read what he has to say about who the first people to spread Buddhism in China were. So it is not without significance that the first organized effort made to translate the Buddhist canon into Chinese was made by the Nagan Chi Kao, a Parthian by nationality. Buddhism was introduced into China by the Indo-Scythians, and it was through that China first came to know of India. So we see again, pretty straightforward, the Indo-Scythians were the first people to spread Buddhism to China, and there's really no way around that. So now let's look at something else. All right, now let's read this book written by a professor of history, who was mainly a professor of Chinese history by the name of Tansis Sin, who says the Pan-Asian endeavor of introducing Buddhism to Han and post-Han China, and what he's referring to here is the Han dynasty in China, which spread from about the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century CE, if I'm not mistaken. So he's basically giving the timeline of Buddhism being spread sometime around this time period. But reading on, he says, is apparent from the fact that some of the earliest transmitters of the doctrine to China included Indo-Scythians, Parthians, Sogdians, and those from Jibin. So we see again that the Indo-Scythians started the spread of Buddhism in China, but they also seem to be accompanied by the Parthians and this other group who were known as the Sogdians, according to some of the authors we read from. All right, so now as I've already stated, both of these ethnic groups were also Scythian in origin, and we'll see a little bit of how the Parthians were in a minute. But let's just see what a scholar had to say about the origin of the other group that is mentioned, which are the Scythians. And we're going to look at what this book has to say in order to gain an understanding of who exactly the Scythians were. And so now let's just read what this book has to say. So the matter is that from the early 1st to the 4th century AD, Indo-Scythian or Indo-Iranian clans, mainly Sogdians, Bactrians, and Western satraps, controlled the Asian part of the Silk Road. All right, so we see again here that this author corroborates what we've already heard multiple times, which is that the Indo-Scythians were the earliest teachers of Buddhism in China that there was. And as the author even confirms a little bit of the ways down where we read, all of these clans were mainly Buddhists. Furthermore, the Sogdians and Bactrians became the propagators of Buddhism in China in the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD. So once again, the Indo-Scythians were in fact the first to spread Buddhism in China. And so now one last book I'll cite from before we move on comes from another highly renowned sinologist, like the first author that I read from, who studied Chinese culture during the mid to late 19th century or in early 1900s, by the name of Edward Harper Parker. And he says in one of his most preeminent works that the Indo-Scythians first told the Chinese of Buddhism. So we should get the point by now. The Indo-Scythians were in fact the very first propagators of Buddhism into China. And so now going back to how this affects our understanding of the Mogao caves and how they portray not just the Buddha, who was literally pictured thousands of times all throughout each mural in these caves, but also how it depicts the disciples that carried Buddhism from one end of the world to another. And we should not only consider what we've looked at recently, but really what I've shown all throughout this video, from Buddha being a Scythian in origin to him being originally portrayed as a so-called black man, and how that depiction of him as a so-called black man should help us to understand how his followers looked like themselves. So now we should be able to look at the images in the Mogao caves and make sense of why the Buddha and the Buddhists, who were directly responsible for the creation of these caves, looked like this. With this first image I'll show of the Mogao cave, we can clearly see that the Buddhist monks who are portrayed here have a black skin complexion. And this is intentional because we can clearly see that everything surrounding these Buddhist monks, down to the very clothes that they are adorned with, have multiple different colors. So this can't just be a result of the artist just portraying them like this for some other reason, or because the painting is old and so the course of centuries and decades has degraded the original paint and made them black because of that particular reason. This is actually how the creators of these paintings decided to depict the Scythian Buddhists. And we know these specifically are the Scythian Buddhists because they are portrayed in the same likeness as the so-called god that they created and worshipped first. Just going back to the earlier authors I cited from, who stated that the Buddha was originally portrayed as a Negro or a so-called black man, and also the other group of writers who stated since Buddha was portrayed as a so-called black man with quote-unquote Negroid features, it can only logically be surmised that the original worshippers of Buddha, who we should already know to have been Scythians, had to have looked like him as well. So this is exactly how the creators of this mural wanted to depict the Scythian Buddhist monks, who brought with them their knowledge of the Buddhist belief system to China. And of course, as I've already stated, it is very clear that the creators of these caves, at the very least, when they were created, were the Indo-Scythian Buddhists. So I'm just going to show a brief, maybe 1.5 minute slideshow of a lot of these images without any commentary, so that you guys can have a chance to look at these images for yourselves. But just keep in mind that, again, these images were painted intentionally by the original creators of these murals in these caves. And the reason why I keep having to emphasize that is because I already know that there will be certain people in the comment section saying, oh, well, the colors are just symbolic and don't really mean anything literal, or that the images, they just got like that over time due to erosion of the artwork, or some other, silly excuse that has no basis in why these images were painted like this originally. And before I get into the slideshow, I just want to read an excerpt from a very highly renowned Australian professor of art and media, who is also an art historian by the name of Rosalind D. Haynes, who can shed some light on what I'm saying pertaining to the color of the skin on these images depicting Buddhist monks, or more specifically Indo-Scythian Buddhist monks, being literally what they look like physically and not just a metaphorical or hyperbolic symbol. So let's just read what this excerpt has to say. So at Mogao, about 25 kilometers southeast of Dunhuang, a complex of caves has cut into a cliff beside the Daquan River and decorated with hundreds of spectacular Buddhist murals painted across the arched ceilings and walls. According to a legend, a Buddhist monk, Yui Zun, had a vision in 366 CE of 1,000 Buddhas, and he, with other wandering monks, carved out caves until after a millennium there were over 1,000. About 500 were decorated as temple caves with murals, statues, and architecture serving as aids to meditation and acting as teaching tools to inform literate Chinese people about Buddhist beliefs and stories. So we see here that this author is excluding the Chinese at the time from the people who were creating these caves, indicating that it was not the Chinese that were the creators of these murals. But reading on, it says, during the long period of construction, there were invasions migrations, and changes of ruler, each successive wave adding its own traditional art, culture, and scenes from daily life. In some caves, a large Buddha is surrounded by Indian, European, or Persian figures, as well as the Uyghur princes and princesses, monks, and travelers. Most of the art has a clear Buddhist focus, depicting stories of sutras against a background of scenery and buildings. Bodhisattvas are depicted as Indian princes, and Apsaras, female celestial beings, abound, but other beliefs are also recorded: Confucianism, Taoism, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and Nestroacianism. There are also intriguing depictions of daily life showing people of different races and skin colors participating in rituals or making music together. The cave images suggest a multicultural interconnectedness and racial and religious tolerance rarely seen today. All right, so this author pretty much sums everything up that I've been saying pertaining to these caves and why there are people that are painted a certain color on these murals, which again is because this was the actual complexion of the people who originally worshipped Buddha and depicted him as a so-called black man. Just again, going back to some of the earlier writers who stated that Buddha was created in the image of a so-called black man, because the people who first worshipped him and spread his teachings across the world were so-called black themselves. This is how we know that the dark-skinned people who are portrayed in these caves were in fact and indeed the Scythian Buddhists who shared the same ancestry with Buddha and were his original acolytes. And their complexion matches the complexion of the oldest images of the Buddha in these murals, which of course was jet black. So again, this is how we know that these are the Indo-Scythian Buddhists. And you know what? I'm just going to read one last thing before the slideshow to accompany the images of the Buddha and his original Scythian followers who made Buddha as he and they actually look like in real life. And this comes from a book written by a Japanese artist from the mid to late 1600s that documents what the complexion of Buddha was, which was based off of the original depiction of Buddha once it was brought to Japan. So now let's read what he says. Let's read what he says in this book. Starting at among the monks at my temple, there's a young Buddha without a face. He has none of the Buddha's 32 characteristic marks and none of his 80 minor marks of physical excellence. He's just a jet black fellow. The Japanese original describes Shakyamuni Buddha as a dark little boy. Makuro Kurumbo, literally black person, a Japanese expression for a Negro or having a Negro complexion. So again, this Japanese description was based off the original appearance of Buddha as being so-called black with a black or Negro complexion. And from what we've already read, we should know that the Buddha was in fact originally depicted as a so-called black man with Negroid features, including with a black complexion. The same complexion the ancient images of Buddha are shown with on these caves and the Scythian Buddhists who were worshiping Buddha. All right, so now I'm going to start this slideshow, but again, it will last for about like a minute or a minute and a half or so. So take the time to review the images, and then we'll move on to the final portion of this video. All right, so now that we've been able to see and have been able to connect all the dots about the Scythians and their connection with Buddha and how he was originally depicted by the same people, these same Scythians he descended from, and became and who became the first worshippers of him as a deity, and also how these Scythians, who were not only Buddha's original worshippers but were his relatives, looked like themselves, we should have a pretty good understanding of how the Scythians actually looked like in history, right? But the thing is, these Scythians associated with the Buddha were only one segment of the Scythian tribes that existed in Europe and Asia, and from the late 8th century BC to roughly the 3rd century BC, and possibly a little longer after that, the fact of the matter is that there were many Scythian tribes, different Scythian tribes that existed throughout this time period. The Scythians we examined were known as the Saka, which I believe I mentioned earlier, but they were the segment of Scythians that were in Central Asia. But again, there were various other Scythian tribes that existed at this time. There were the Pontic Scythians, who existed mainly within the regions of the bigger countries within Eastern Europe. So like Ukraine and Russia is where a lot of these group of Scythians were most present at. But then you also had the Sarmatians, who mainly inhabited the areas near the Caucasus Mountains, and like the Pontic Scythians, they inhabited large areas within Russia, near Russia's largest river known as the Volga River, and also the Don River. And then there was also a group of Scythians known as the Massagetæ, and they inhabited the desert area of Central Asia. Now, these are just a few of the names for the designations of Scythian tribes that migrated out to these different areas within Europe and Asia after they had left Iran. And if I were to get into examining individual tribes, we would be here all day since there were so many of them. But what I can break down before I close this video out are the names of certain individual tribes that were attested to by scribes of the ancient world, who not only described their deeds, but also described what they looked like as well. So let's take a look at a few of these Scythian tribes so that we can confirm even more that the Scythians, who we'll see in the next video, were in fact the ancestors of the great establishers of the Dark Ages, or the medieval time period known as the Germanic tribes. These same people who were their ancestors were in fact peoples of color. So now let's take a look at a very well-known group of nomadic warriors that a lot of you who are watching may know about, that terrorized the Roman Empire during the time of the quote-unquote Byzantine Empire around the 4th century to the 6th century AD. These nomadic people in history have come to be known as the Huns, and the Huns were a group of people that actually lived in all of the areas which were associated with Scythian occupation at the time, and they were found in Central Asia. They were also found in the Caucasus region, Eastern Europe, etc., etc. So they were quite ubiquitous all across the large region of land called by the ancient authors Scythia. So it can be difficult to pin down one singular tribe these nomadic warriors could have belonged to, and some relatively modern scholars have tried to link the Huns to a totally different ethnic group that were not quote-unquote Scythian in origin. But one such Scythian group out of all of the ancient authors stated that the Huns could have came from uniformly was the Massagetæ. Once again, the Massagetæ inhabited mainly Central Asia, and the Huns, they were also very ubiquitous in Central Asia themselves, although they were first recorded coming out of the area Scythian tribes like the Sarmatians and Pontic Scythians came from, which was the Volga region in Russia. It's very possible that they did not originate there, but that's just where they first were documented at. And not to digress too much, but the same thing can be said about the Scythians overall, because they did not come from Iran. Iran is just where they were found at, but in reality, the Scythians came from somewhere else and were just found first within the region of Iran, or Media, as it was anciently called. But I'll discuss that in even further depth on my biblical channel, which you guys have to go and check out, especially as I go through the history of Europe, because this series will correlate with the very first series on that channel in terms of this series helping to shed light on who the scattered abroad people of Israel actually looked like and who they actually are in history, and how we can trace back who they are to this very day. But let's get back to this examination of the Huns and how they relate to the Scythians. Again, a lot of ancient historians stated that they were part of the Scythian group known as the Massagetæ, and we're going to see just a few of those historians' statements about the origins of the Huns being Scythian right now. All right, so now we're going to briefly go over the Huns and how their origins are tied to being identified as a quote-unquote Scythian people. And then afterwards, we're going to see how they looked like so that we can confirm once more that the Scythians, for the most part, were a people of color. And before I get into this, I just want to clear up some things that I've been stating about the Scythians being a people of color, which is that I'm not trying to suppose that all of the Scythians were a people of color. The term Scythian applied to a wide variety of tribes that happened to live within the same area as the so-called Scythian people, but the original Scythians that came out of Iran, anciently known as Media, and migrated out to the various regions of Europe, Asia, and the Caucasus they migrated to, those Scythians were peoples of color or so-called black, and the Huns came as a result of that group of nomads, particularly from the Scythian group known as the Massagetæ. The Massagetæ were first mentioned as ancient. The Massagetæ were first mentioned as ancient as far as we know by the legendary historian Herodotus, who was one of, if not the first people to speak about the Scythians and their culture in detail. So let's read a few excerpts from this academia website that cite what Herodotus had to say about the Massagetæ and how later historians related this Scythian group with the Huns. So we'll actually start with the first paragraph at the very top. So about the origin of the Massagetæ, scholars have emphasized that the classical and modern authorities say that the word Massagetæ means great Getæ. The 9th century work, De Universio of Rabanus Maurus, states the Massagetæ are an origin from the tribe of the Scythians and are called Massagetæ as if heavy, that is strong Getæ. All right, so we see clearly from this passage that a 9th century chronicler documented that the Massagetæ were in fact Scythians. So now let's go down and read the citation this website gives from the works of Herodotus. So according to Herodotus, in their dress and mode of living, the Massagetæ resembled the Scythians. They fight both on horseback and on foot. Neither method is strange to them. They use bows and lances, but their favorite weapon is the battle axe. Their arms are all either of gold or brass. For their spear points and arrowheads and their battle axes, they make use of brass. For headgear, belts, and girdles of gold. So too with the caparison of their horses, they give them breastplates of brass, but employ gold in about the reins, the bit, and the cheek plates. They use neither iron nor silver, having none in their country, but they have brass and gold in abundance. All right, so we see here that Herodotus is relaying how the practices of the Scythians and the Massagetæ are very similar to one another, down to the way in which both groups of people dress, how they fight on horseback, their proficiency with the bow and arrow, as well as the battle axe, etc. So the Scythians as a whole were very well known throughout the ancient world for their expertise with the bow and arrow, and so were all of their descendants, including, no surprise, the Huns. But let's go down here and see one last statement from Herodotus that confirms the origin of the Massagetæ coming from the Scythians. So when Cyrus had achieved the conquest of the Babylonians, he conceived the desire of bringing the Massagetæ under his dominion. Now the Massagetæ are said to be a great and warlike nation, dwelling eastward toward the rising of the sun beyond the river Araxes and opposite the Isodones. By many, they are regarded as a Scythian race. So that's pretty straightforward. The Massagetæ from the ancient world were confirmed by many chroniclers and scholars to be of the so-called Scythian race. And even today, many scholars will attribute the Massagetæ as one of the 4 major Scythian bands that migrated all throughout Central Asia, Europe, and the Caucasus. So these were for sure Scythians. And so now let's go down a little bit more here and see what a couple of contemporary scholars who witnessed the rise of the Huns within Byzantine Rome during the 4th to 6th centuries AD had to say. They were, for those of you who don't know, one of the greatest threats to the Byzantine Empire, the Huns were, and they would customarily defeat the Byzantines in battle so badly to the point where the Byzantines had to pay them off to try and get them to leave. And this was especially the case during the time of the great and famous Hunnic ruler known as Attila the Hun, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute here. But let's read what this 6th century Byzantine chronicler Prosopius had to say about the Huns and where they came from. So Prosopius writes in History of the Wars, Book 3, the Vandalic War, the Massagetæ, whom they now call Huns, there was a certain man among the Massagetæ, well gifted with courage and strength of body, the leader of a few men. This man had the privilege the privilege handed down from his fathers and ancestors to be the first in all the Hunnic armies to attack the enemy. Okay, so Procopius stated in his chronicle that the Huns were one and the same with the Scythian Massagetei, according to many during this time. As a matter of fact, it looks as though he's saying that the identity of the Massagetei just became known during that time by the name of the Huns. So the Huns, according to this relatively ancient author, were in fact the Massagetei, but there is another ancient author this website cites who was actually a contemporary of Procopius, and so he would have had the same understanding of the dynamics of the time that Procopius did. And this ancient scholar was named Evagrius Scholastius. So let's read what he has to say pertaining to his thoughts on the Huns and who they descended from. And in Thrace, by the inroads of the Huns, formerly known by the name of Massagetei, who crossed the Ister without opposition. So again, we see another ancient scholar who withholds the understanding that the Huns were in fact one and the same with the Massagetei, which would thereby make them one and the same with the Scythians. But let's just see if we can get a bit more confirmation behind what these ancient authors stated about why the Scythians were equated with the Massagetei and how this ultimately relates to the Scythians. So now this is a scholarly book written in the early 1900s by a scholar/historian, or I should say historical society dedicated to the study of quote-unquote Asiatic or Oriental history. It's basically just a compilation of historical writings from the time period. But let's read what this has to say pertaining to the Huns and their deeper relation to the Massagetei, according to chroniclers at the time who were trying to figure out where they came from. And from the many different similarities in the characteristics and way of living the Huns had with the Scythians, they came the reasoning for why so many ancient scholars called them part of the Scythians. So now let's read what this article has to say. So according to the Gothic tradition, the Goths, by the way, they were a Germanic people, and they'll be pivotal in understanding what the ultimate main topic is of this series, which of course is seeing how the Scythians were the ancestors of the Germans. But let's just keep reading. So the Hun people consisted of two tribes. The maternal stock of Getic origin was never in the neighborhood of China. Together with the Gothic historians, the contemporary historians of the Greeks, the Armenians, and Romans knew actually the Huns as originating from the Massagetei, or as allies of the Massagetei. In this way, the Greek historians Evagrius and Procopius, the two historians that I just cited from, by the way, the Armenian historians Faustus and Elisius, and finally the Latin historians who were contemporary with the migration of the Huns, especially Saint Hieronymus, state that the Huns lived amongst the most dreaded of the Massagetei. Lastly, Ammianus Marcellinus, in the most trustworthy of manner, records that the Huns in every aspect were very similar to the Alans, who lived in that stretch of country from the river Don to the Indus, formerly known by the name Massagetei. All right, so this passage said a lot, but the main takeaway is from what was said at the very beginning, that being that all of these different sources said the same thing about the Huns, which was that they either were the Massagetei, like the two Byzantine authors I cited from previously said, or that they lived amongst the Massagetei. But them living amongst the Massagetei was most likely due to the fact that they were of the same stock as them, as the Massagetei, just as Procopius and Evagrius stated in their chroniclings of their origins. So now let's read what another historian stated pertaining to the origins of the Huns. So this is the 19th century Punjabi historian and scholar that I've cited from a couple of times throughout this video by the name of Saad Muhammad Latif. So let's read what he has to say about his ancestors' belief of where the Huns originated from. So a considerable portion of the routed army of the Scythians settled in the Punjab, and a race of them called Nomardi inhabited the country on the west bank of the Indus. They are described as a nomadic tribe living in wooden houses after the Scythian fashion and settling where they found sufficient pasturage. A portion of these settlers, descendants of the Massagetei, were the Gets, from whom sprung the modern Jats. These Scythian barbarians were known in the Punjab by the appellation of the Huns, and the violent contests between the Indians and the Huns were not only testified to by Sanskrit Sanskrit writers, but also proved by inscriptions on pillars in a most ancient Sanskrit dialect. And I'm going to read the inscription real quick here. Trusting in his wisdom, the king of Gar or Bengal for a long time enjoyed the countries of the eradicated race of Yucatal or Orissa, of the Huns, of humbled pride of the kings of Javir, country south of the Carnatic, and Gujar, whose glory was reduced in the universal sea-girt throne. All right. So we see here that the historian not only states that the Huns, who were the descendants of the Scythian Massagetei, were mentioned in ancient records and in ancient Indian records, but he also shows that their presence was attested to. So this is even further proof that, again, the Huns were in fact of Scythian origin, and we can look for further confirmation of this by looking at another historian who stated the same thing. This book right here was written by an Austrian historian who was a professor of medieval history by the name of Walter Pohl, which the Huns in their presence actually follow the timeline of the medieval time period. So we should be able to use him as a reliable source for the Huns and their existence during their time period. But in this book, he states the Huns were often called Scythians, and the Avars and Bulgars in their turn Huns. So again, another scholar confirms that the Huns were in fact referred to as Scythians, and just for good measure, confirming that the Huns and their ancestors, the Massagetei, were Scythians, I'll read from this book right here by a lecturer of history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, by the name of Timothy C. Hart, who states, Prosopius, writing in the mid-6th century, presents a clearer ethnographic voice. For him, Attila's Huns were still Massagetei, an explicitly Asian subset of Scythians. So again, we can see that the Huns and Massagetei are identified with that of these Scythians, but we'll look at one last professor of history by the name of Gabor Klanavike or Klanavike, and also a contributor of this book too was a French historian by the name of Michael Werner, and he stated in this work that the Cumans or the Huns, a nation speaking the same language as the Hungarians, undeniably descended from the ancient Scythians, came to Hungary around the year 374. So it should be understood that the Huns were in fact the descendants of the Scythians. And just real quick, because it kind of segues into the next step we're going to take with this, it has to do with the other name of a group of people from Hungary that this particular book cites, which were the Cumans, who were a group of people that were mainly found in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, especially in places like Romania, Moldova, and the country that this book mentions, which was Hungary. And what's interesting about the Cumans is that they were mentioned in Scandinavian sources like runic stones and inscriptions as the Blaku men, which a lot of scholars have translated as the black men. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this term and how the Cumans could be the same people as the Huns, as these scholars seem to be implying, because the video will go on longer than what I intended. But one thing I will say is that if the Huns were the same people as the Cumans, and the Cumans or Huns were referred to as Blaku men or black men, so-called black men, that would be very consistent with how the Huns were anciently described by various different people who saw them with their own eyes. The most vivid description of the Huns comes from a 6th century Roman bureaucrat by the name of Jordanes in his Origins of the Deeds of the Goths historical chronicle, where he describes the Huns as such. For by the terror of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because of their swarthy aspect. Now, I've said many times on this channel that the term swarthy during antiquity and even later on into the medieval time period meant something totally different from what it can be taken to mean today. Back then, if someone was referred to as being of a quote-unquote swarthy complexion, or if a group of people were referred to as being of a swarthy complexion, they were really being referred to as being what we call today so-called black. The proof of this is in regards to the Huns, as when we take a look at the original translation of the term that was used to describe the Huns by Jordanes, using this book right here, which was written by an Austrian historian and historical writer by the name of Otto J. Mackenhelfen, and it states, Jordanes stress the small stature, exiguiforme, and the swarthy complexion of the Huns, species pavenda negridinis. Now, that last term, negridinis, is a Latin word that derives from the term negri, which in turn derives from the term negere. Now, for you guys who have been on this channel for a while, you know that I broke down this term negri or negir and was able to show that it quite literally meant someone who had a black complexion, i.e. a so-called person of color or a so-called black person. And I'm not going to do a deep breakdown of the word again for the sake of the time in this video, but within this book, the author cites other examples of figures who were referred to as negir, just like the Huns. If you look farther down, the author cites two descriptions that were given, which were one of the Byzantine Roman Emperor Valens, who he cites a description that he stated he was of nigris coloris, and then the author cites the description of another historical figure living at the time by the name of Pompripius, who he states was described in the same exact way. Now, the latter figure, Pompripius, was an Egyptian by birth and was part of the aboriginal Egyptian stock that was left over even after all the years of admixture with other nations that had conquered Egypt, which is why he was described from that particular word of negris, and also why the book cites that a 19th century historian by the name of Thomas Hodgkin stated that Pompripius was a Negro or a so-called black person. Now, we should know, due to these series I've done in the past on the ancient Egyptians, that they were in fact so-called black Africans. The ancient scholars like Herodotus said so himself, comparing the ancient Egyptians to another ethnic group known as the Colchians, who he stated were the ancient Egyptians were the descendants of the ancient Egyptians because of their black complexion and woolly hair. And we know that this was what Herodotus actually meant, because even much later chroniclers and historians like Saint Jerome and Sophronus called the land of the Colchis a second Ethiopia, and the latter chronicler stated that he saw Ethiopians, quote-unquote Ethiopians, in the same territory that the Colchians resided at. So the Colchians were so-called black, which is why they were associated with the ancient Egyptians, and why Pompripius was described with the term negris. The Romans even depicted the Egyptians of their time with black complexion, like what this is shown right here on this Roman mosaic of two Egyptians. Also, the hero from Homer's Iliad, Memnon, was referred to as a negri in a Roman revised version of the Iliad written by the Roman poet Virgil, and this indicated that Memnon was a so-called black man with a so-called black complexion, which is how he is traditionally depicted. So what all of this means for the Huns is that they were called this term negridinis, again a word that derived from negri and negir, because like the definition implies, they were of a so-called black complexion. Other historians also interpreted and translated the Huns being referred to as so-called black as well, such as this historian John Williams, who cited a description of the Huns from a British medieval chronicle known as the Triads of the British Isles, in which it states there were 3 invading tribes that came to the Isle of Britain and went out of it. The third were the Caesarians, who harassed the island for more than 400 years till they went to Rome to oppose the eruption of the Black Horde. The quote-unquote Black Horde was in reference to the Huns, and when we look down, we see that the author provides us with context behind who this term was referring to and why they were called this particular term. The author states the northern Huns of the Crimea who ravaged Europe are here denominated the Black Horde from their swarthy complexion. So we see here that once again the Huns were referred to as a quote-unquote black group of people, which a lot of these scholars will try to translate as swarthy to try and throw off the fact that they were in fact described as a quote-unquote black people or people of color. But in reality, as we've seen, the Huns were in fact literally described as so-called black. So we know that that is what they were at the end of the day. Let's look at one more statement made by an archaeologist from Switzerland by the name of M. M. Tragot Huber, who stated that for number one, there was another group of Huns who were known conventionally amongst the Romans as the White Huns, and there was also another group of Huns that were known amongst the Romans known as the Black Huns. Now, we know that these descriptions are an allusion to the complexion of both groups of Huns, because even this archaeologist alludes to in his books, where he cites Prosopius again, where he states in this article, he noted the Hephaestus, aka the White Huns, were the only ones amongst the Huns who had quote-unquote white bodies. So these were the only Huns that had quote-unquote white bodies, or who could be identified as so-called white. And then he states, later on in the sentence after that, he says, this of course rules out the true Huns with a swarthy complexion, and he cites the same ancient Roman author that gave the Huns the name Nigridinis, which indicated that they were of a black complexion. So this just proves the point I made earlier about the true Scythian tribes, like the original Huns of swarthy complexion, that they were peoples of color, despite there being other tribes of fairer skin amongst the Scythians who were also called that name and were given that designation. Now, this is definitely proof of that assertion. We read enough about the Huns, but I just want to use one more example having to do with their tribe that proves that they were a people of color. Let's first use the 19th century Scottish antiquarian named David MacRitchie, who stated that the Huns were described as being of a dark complexion, almost black, and then he cites a contemporary historian at the same time that he lived and that he was doing his works, by the name of Edward Gibbon, who stated that the Huns were distinguished because of features such as their broad shoulders, small eyes, and flat noses. So the Huns not only had a so-called dark, almost black complexion, but they had flat noses as well. That sounds very much like a people of color to me, but this description is actually consistent with a description of the most well-known figure historically that sprang forth from the Huns and led them to the pinnacle of their power. This figure that I'm referring to, of course, is Attila the Hun, and he was described as such by the same 6th century Roman historian who we saw give a description of the Huns as a whole, Jordanes. But his personal description of Attila was that he was short of stature with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard was thin and sprinkled with gray, and he had a flat nose and a swarthy complexion, showing the evidences of his origin. So we see here that Attila's appearance, him having a so-called swarthy, really black complexion, from what we've seen, that term swarthy being translated meaning during that time period being black, and then him having a flat nose indicated that he was of quote-unquote black Hunnic descent, who were the quote-unquote true Huns according to the last author that I cited from, which would mean that he and that segment of Huns were part of the true band of Scythians that spread themselves all throughout Europe and Asia. And this could kind of be a callback to what was stated by one of the earlier historians I cited from, Timothy C. Hart, who stated that Attila's Huns, specifically Attila's Huns, who were the Black Huns, were Massagetae, an ancient sub-component of the Scythians. Other historians, such as the highly renowned professor of history at New York University by the name of Larry Wolff, stated in this book, Attila and the Huns as a whole were vaguely identified as Scythians. And then just one last author of history as well as literary studies by the name of Peter Hadru. In this work he compiled states that Attila was mentioned in a historical chronicle known as the Gesta Hungorum as being a descendant of Magog who left Scythia to conquer the Carpathian Basin. So it should be pretty obvious by now, based on all of the examples that I showed, that the Huns were in fact Scythians, and that they, like the true Scythians, were a people of color. So now that we've gone over the Huns, let's take a look at a few more groups that existed and were identified as Scythian that were also stated to have been so-called black, just like the original Scythians who worshipped the Buddha were, and the Scythians in history were in general. So now I mentioned another subgroup of Scythians besides the Massagetæ that occupied probably the most regions of any Scythian group at the time, and these were the Scythian Sarmatians. Now these Sarmatians don't have as many historical descriptions that I can cite from as say a group like the Huns, but there is one vivid description of their tribe that comes from an ancient Greek physician and historical chronicler by the name of Hippocrates, who was cited in this book by a French 19th century geographer by the name of Comrade Maltais-Brun, who stated in a brief excerpt from this book that he compiled that Hippocrates, a contemporary of Herodotus, supposed the Sarmatians a Scythian people that differed from the other Scythians, for their women used the bow and the javelin, but in other respects his account of the Scythians is applicable to the Sarmatians. The people are swarthy, short, and fat, of a relaxed and phlegmatic temperament. Okay, so yet again we can see that another Scythian tribe, which was actually a major component that made up the Scythians as a whole, were described as swarthy, which we should know from the previous example that the ancient authors, when they used that word to describe somebody, it was interchangeable with black. And you know, a lot of these scholars during the 19th century and 20th century, and even down to today, a lot of them will try to translate words from the ancient world into modern day English terms that will come out to be swarthy or dark. A couple of historians have tried to translate the description Herodotus gave of the Egyptians being black in complexion with woolly hair to being just dark with curly hair, which of course leaves the door open for speculation in regards to their physical appearance. Even descriptions of ancient fictional figures like the herald of the Homeric hero Odysseus, who was named Eurybates, has been reduced to him being called dark with curly hair, when in reality the original description stated that he was a man who was of black complexion with woolly hair, which is far more straightforward and vivid in regards to what he looked like, which was a so-called black man. And even Odysseus himself was described as being black with woolly hair, as I've shown in my video about Greek mythology that you guys can go ahead and check out. But again, his description was reduced to him having just quote unquote dark with as to him being quote unquote dark with curly hair. So the point is, whenever we see a figure in history being described as swarthy or even dark, and those two particular words are translated in the English language, most of the time those people who were called those terms, that either was meant to imply being so-called black or dark brown, just like with the Huns and the other examples that I gave. So the Sarmatians were described as a contemporary by a contemporary of their time, as being a people of swarthy complexion, which should indicate that they were a people of color. But now let's look at another Scythian tribe that gave themselves a name that literally meant swarthy people. So you know what, actually, before we look at that particular group of Scythians, I just want to go over a connection that I found, which actually connects the tribe of legendary female warriors known as the Amazons with the previous group of Scythians we saw the description of, which were of course the Sarmatians. And it is found in this book, which states about the Amazons. By the time of Hippocrates, the Amazons had already founded a Scythian nation of the Sarmatai in Europe, and in Europe is a Scythian race dwelling around Lake Maeotis, which differs from the other races. Their name is Saramatae. Their women, so long as they are virgins, ride, shoot, throw the javelin while mounted, and fight with their enemies. So that right there is meant to describe the Amazons, and them being referred to as Scythians by the ancient Greek writer I cited from the descriptions of the Sarmatians which stated that they were swarthy. But this book also states that Herodotus acknowledged that the Amazons as a part of the Sarmatian tribe that joined the Scythians in their war against the Persians and their king Darius. So the author also cites the ancient Greek poet, tragedian poet Aeschylus, who states that the Amazons inhabited the region of the Caucasus around the same time the Scythians dominated that region, which indicates that they were part of the Scythian band that had settled there. And lastly, the author cites Stephanus of Byzantium, who himself cited an ancient Greek historian by the name of Epiphorus, who identified the Amazons as the Sarmatidae from living in Sarmatian Scythia. So the Amazons, according to the ancient Greek writers, were considered Scythians in origin, and what makes this even more interesting is that they, according to the author of this book, he states, according to the earliest accounts that came from Aeschylus, that the Amazons were dark-skinned female warriors that resemble the natives of Libya. And then he even cites where this is said at by Aeschylus, who stated, "For you are more similar to the women of Libya, and in no way similar to those native to our land." And what's interesting about this comparison to the Libyans is that the Libyans were understood by the ancient Greeks and other ancient cultures to be a people of color, which is why early ancient Greek writers like Hesiod stated that one of their ancient mythological figures by the name of Epiphus was the ancestor of the dark Libyans and the high-souled Ethiopians and the underground folk, as well as the Pygmies. All of the ethnic groups Hesiod gave an account of in regards to them being descendants of Epiphus were unquestionably so-called black. So the fact that the Libyans were grouped up in that group just goes to show that they themselves had to have been of the same composition. But also other ancient Greek writers like Herodotus stated that the Libyans were more woolly haired than any other nation of people on the planet at that time. Woolly hair is of course a synonym for so-called black hair, which once again indicates their physical appearance. But also various ancient depictions of the Libyans by people like the ancient Egyptians tells us all that we need to know about the appearance of the ancient peoples of Libya. So with all this being the case, the Amazons being compared to Libyan women should tell us that these Amazonian women were women of color, just as it was stated by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates that the Sarmatians were quote unquote swarthy. Okay, so the Amazons were also of the Sarmatian tribe of Scythians. So now we can confirm them being described as swarthy meant that they were in fact described as so-called black, the Sarmatians. And this book cites two other Scythian tribes whose name quite literally meant swarthy warriors, as is the case of this tribe right here, who were known as the Tokairoi, who, interestingly enough, this tribe of Scythians were in Dun Huang around the same time the Indo-Scythian Buddhists were present there as well, which just confirms that the first Scythian Buddhists that migrated there were in fact peoples of color, just like we saw them being depicted as in the Mogaio caves. And then here is this other Scythian tribe known as the Chorasmoi, who this author states, according to the ancient Greek geographer Strabo, the Atasi and Chorasmi belong to the Masagete and Sake. So these are two obvious Scythian tribes right there. So that just confirms the Chorasmoi's origin, and of course them being described as so-called swarthy helps us understand that they were a people of color. So we've seen some pretty good examples of whole individual Scythian tribes that were unquestionably described as people of color, and there are actually a lot more, but just for the sake of this video I'm going to stop right there. But now that we've seen who the Scythians were and what they actually looked like in history, we can now transition over to the so-called Germanic tribes and see how they were described and see how they descended from the Scythians and how they were described. Now of course we're not going to do that in this video, but we're going to do it in the next video, where we're going to see not only how the Germans were how they descended from the Scythians, but also how the descriptions of both these related nomadic groups have been altered over the decades and really over the centuries to make both of these ethnic groups seem like they would be very similar in appearance to modern day so-called Caucasians with blonde/red hair and blue eyes. This is not how either of these tribes look like in history, and as we've already seen with these Scythians, and as we'll see with the descendants of the Scythians, who of course once again were the Germanic tribes, that will be the case for them as well. So look out for that video when it comes out.